with minority people, how can we prevent white terrorism? You know what I mean? Because if there's a 9/11 attack, we're going to war. You know what I mean? If there's something that happens with a non-white person who commits terrorism, something's going to happen. You know what I mean? We're going to call out that country. We're going to call out the Middle East. We're going to call out this. We're going to call out that thing. We're going to call out China. We're going to call out if it's not white, we'll call it out. Bonjour, this is Jasmine. Thank you so much for stopping and smell the roses on Rue Madame. For those of you who are new to the neighborhood, I am a writer, a storyteller, and a community builder. I write about culture, politics, parenthood, and my life here in France. Check out the blog. It's over on Patreon, where you get articles, essays, and full videos on the content you see here, as well as the Rue Madame book club. And we are at the end of Americana, and it's really exciting. Talks about a lot of interesting and nuanced material, but with a great story that's understandable and relatable. Love that. So head over there, become a patron, and support this passion project. Today, I'd like to talk about something serious. In the news, we've heard a lot of support and attention put on the Asian community because of a recent incident where people were killed. So on my social media, we have Stop Asian Hate. And it's very tragic what has happened, but we don't have a lot of attention on the hate and the discrimination that this community faces, particularly because of the constant and overwhelming incidences of police brutality and people getting killed by law enforcement. If it's not George Floyd, who was killed under the knee of a killer, and then you have Breonna Taylor, who was in her house minding her business when a group of police officers killed her. So it goes on and on. We've had the recent anniversaries of their deaths and their lack of justice. But the Asian community, as well as the Hispanic community, as well as the LGBTQ community, and the Muslim community, and the Jewish community, all of these communities are always, I feel like, are lacking in their focus on them as far as the media is concerned, as far as people really realizing that everyone needs the mic, everyone needs support, you know. But it's hard to do that when you have people that are supposed to protect these communities who are killing, you know, mostly Black lives. And, you know, I've talked about it in great detail on this, in this neighborhood. So, I'm just, I don't know, at a loss for words as I continue to look at the news and hear about the news. And being in France, it just takes me out of it a little bit. And I'm just looking at it like, wow, this is where we're at, you know? So there was an incident of a white terrorist who went to 3 Asian American establishments, I believe, and who killed 6 people of Asian descent and 2 others, a total of 8 people. And they were helpless, and they were officially, unfortunately, they're no longer with us. And the aftermath of that already atrocious event was the police officer who mentioned how the white terrorists had a bad day and this is why he did what he did. And just like very compassionate and understanding. And maybe if he wasn't compassionate and understanding, but he gave a lot of emphasis on the excuse and not on the people who are like no longer with us. So if it's not one thing, it's like a compound thing when we don't, highlight enough, apparently, the suffering of these communities, Asian community, in this case, particularly. And mostly women were targeted as well, which is another compound of interest on the story, because it's never enough attention, never enough emphasis on the lack of important, detailed, and significant information about these particular, incidences and groups. So I hear a lot of stop Asian hate that is circulating, and this is what's going on right now. And I just want to give my condolences first and foremost to the people who are affected by this, their families, but just the community as a whole, because even though I wasn't touched, or my family wasn't touched by Sandra Bland or Trayvon Martin or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd or Adama Traoré in France, Black people still feel it, which you know what I mean? So even if you're not specifically targeted, or you've never even experienced a hate crime per se, you still feel that. So I just want to give my energy to the people, especially in this particular group, who are dealing with this tragedy. But another thing that I saw on social media that stuck out to me was one person, or many people, I'm sure, they crossed out "Stop Asian Hate" because they didn't think it was as accurate and precise as it should be, and they replaced it with "Stop White Terrorism." Of course, we can have both, and we should have both. But I think that is really telling how it's almost always omitted from the coverage of these type of incidences, which is white terrorism. Because I feel like we have a lot of omission in the form of this, which is also protecting racism, which is also protecting white terrorism. Not mentioning it, not calling it out for what it is, and always going around it, like beating around the bush, especially like in the incidents after the fact where the police chief talked about the man's mental, or his intentions, which is irrelevant at the end of the day because people are dead. We always omit the elephant in the room, which is white terrorism. You know what I mean? Because we have Black Lives Matter, and we have Protect Trans Lives, and we have Protect this group and that group, and it goes on and on and on. But we never call out the whiteness and the racism and the white supremacy that's like underneath all of that. You know what I mean? For example, you have this incidence of Asian Americans, and then we had the incident in with a white man going to a all immigrant city, or mostly immigrant city, with Mexican immigrants and people of Mexican descent, and shooting up a Walmart or something. And that was racially motivated. There was, I believe, a manifesto, and he was a Trump supporter and things like that. These type of things have, you know what I mean? And then you have the 21-year-old who went into a black church and killed 9 parishioners. And then you have the 17-year-old who went to a Black Lives Matter protest and killed 2 people, and he's out on bail, and it goes on and on and on. Even back to the Oklahoma bomber. I don't know if you remember that. The Oklahoma, you should. But apparently that was also racially, he had racial ties to like extremist groups of white terrorism. And it just doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. And I think stop white terrorism is the hashtag. You know what I mean? Like, stop Asian hate. Yes, stop Asian hate. Like, we need to put a highlight on this community who is always undervalued because there's so much predominant and overwhelming hate and vitriol and violence towards the most noticeable group, the most, the historical group of the people that's been historically lynched. And you understand what I'm saying? So they never, and that's why I feel like people play into that competition. They play into that that idea that, if it wasn't for the blacks, other people would have their rights and their dignities and their attention because the blacks are always, as if we want this title of always being targeted. Like, because I remember reading an article, it was the reaction to the call with Joe Biden and the civil rights leader. And this person was a supporter of the Dreamers, and I think he was Latinx, and he was saying how he agreed with Joe Biden when Joe Biden said, civil rights leaders, you should work with the Latinx group because they're suffering too, and they outnumber you now, so you should probably work together, and blase. And this writer who was Latinx said, I kind of agree with that because the civil rights leaders think it's all about them, and it's like, first of all, white terrorism is the problem. White supremacy is the problem. Insensitive white politicians, majority, who say dumb, insensitive things like that is the problem. So instead of targeting these civil rights leaders who spent their entire life and livelihoods and careers fighting for everybody, not just black people, because they are civil rights leaders. You know what I mean? Civil rights, applies to everybody. That's why they're civil rights. So, you know what I mean? So, trying to make it seem like it's a competition or and then you have a lot of people talking about, this is a good opportunity for Black Lives Matter to support Asian lives. Of course we support Asian lives. Of course Black Lives Matter supports Asian lives. Of course everybody, black, white, or other, don't want to see other people getting killed by white terrorism. So I just feel like naming white terrorism and not omitting it and not leaving it up for assumption, you know what I mean? Because I mentioned on before that I love the psychologist or sociologist, Dr. Rama D'Angelo, and she really talks a lot about this, about how whiteness is always centered, but it's never said. It's centered, but it's never pointed at. You know what I mean? Because when we talk about diversity, when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about all of these things, we're always thinking of, so we need more black people, and we need more Hispanic people, and we need more Asian people, and we need all of this. But it's always compared to the majority white that's already sitting in the chairs and making decisions. And we never point at them and say, we need diversity because you guys won't get up. We need diversity because whiteness is always suffocating us all, So instead of pointing at that, what they do is say, you know what black people can do for them? You know what other people can do for the Asian community at this moment? You know, instead of saying, how can we prevent another incident like this where a white troubled man lost in his whiteness, upset with the world about his own, fetishes or what have you with minority people, how can we prevent white terrorism? You know what I mean? Because if there's a 9/11 attack, we're going to war. You know what I mean? If there's something that happens with a non-white person who commits terrorism, something's going to happen. You know what I mean? We're going to call out that country. We're going to call out the Middle East. We're going to call out this. We're going to call out that thing. We're going to call out China. We're going to call out if it's not white, we'll call it out. You know what I mean? But when it's white terrorism, which is on the rise, has been on the rise, has never stopped since the civil rights, since slavery, since the beginning of this country, whiteness or white terrorism specifically. So all white people, no, I'm talking about specific white terrorism there's never a war on that. There's a war on drugs, i.e. war on black people and people of color, but there's never a war on white terrorism. And that's alarming. We've had a terrorist attack on the Capitol recently on January 6th, where a police officer was murdered, and other people lost their lives. Was there a war on terrorism? White terrorism specifically, because that was a white terrorist attack. And people say, well, terrorists, you shouldn't use that word so loosely. Everybody's not terrorists if they commit something heinous. Okay. But we already know what that's about. If you're black or brown, it's terrorism. If you're white, it isn't. So let's just call it, let's be equal. Let's be fair. You know what I mean? Like, this is the age of equality, right? So let's just be fair with it. Unfortunately, there was a teacher here in France that was killed and beheaded. And they considered it motivated by the suspect's belief system. I believe he was Muslim or Islamic, to a certain degree, but extremist nonetheless. And of course, they attributed it to a form of terrorism, even if it was one person who was killed heinously. In France, they said terrorism. terrorism. Like, if it's one person, there were foot soldiers in Nice, in a city in the south. They were stabbed or something, and it was one lone person, but he was a person of color, so it's terrorism, flat out. They don't say, well, it's not terrorism really. No, they don't second guess it at all. But for white terrorists, it's always like, well, it's not really terrorist because he didn't have a political affiliation and blah, blah, blah. For example, you have, I think it was Australia, and it was church or synagogue and people were killed, and the person was like a white terrorist, white male, angry terrorist. And we didn't get that footage, that news coverage of terrorism. We got, okay, it was a white male. He went to us, and he killed, that's it. There was no, so I just think stopping white terrorism would eliminate these needs or these calls for action for every single group that white terrorism hits. You know what I mean? Instead of just targeting this one thing, we have to say, oh, well, stop Asian hate, or stop, trans hate, stop this and stop that. And yes, stop all of that. But stop white terrorism first. And we can just reduce, because everything is a white terrorism, obviously. But we will reduce a lot of these hashtags if we just said what we needed to say. Do you get what I'm saying? Tell me what you think. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know. But that's how I feel. I just feel like we need to state the obvious. So in summary, instead of telling other minority groups to support other minority groups, which we already do, what we need to focus on is the majority that don't call out themselves and don't call out their own group and don't call out their own mess before they tell other people to support, So again, condolences to the 8 people who lost their lives. And let's talk about it. Leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.